Hello, everyone. I'm Jaya Ravindran, co-director, Milli Archives Foundation. Along with Maya Dodd and Venkat Srinivasan, my colleagues and co-directors of Milli Archives Foundation, we welcome you all to Milli Sessions 2024. It's been really heartening to see that some of you are joining from far off, from very different time zones. That's really encouraging. Why are we all here? We are all here to celebrate the International Archives Week. In fact, this year, as you may be knowing, International Council on Archives has designated 3rd to 9 June as the International Archives Week, and we are here to celebrate that. This has been an annual feature since 2019, basically to promote archives and archivists. We all know the role that archives and archivists play in protecting, preserving both tangible and intangible memories of a country and its people. But we also know that their roles have not been acknowledged much. It was with this intention that way back in 2007, International Council on Archives, or ICA as we call it, they decided to designate 9 June as the International Archives Day. Why 9 June? Because that was the day that ICA was constituted under the auspices of UNESCO, way back in 1948. So this particular day was supposed to be a day when all the archives and archives professionals across the globe get an opportunity to talk about the importance of archives and tell everyone the importance of preserving archives and acknowledging the role that archives and archivists play. So here we are as part of the same celebration. For those of you who are not much familiar with Milli or who already know about it, let me just start with a brief introduction to Milli. Milli, as the term, it is found in different languages, and the different meanings also are there, but most of it relates to the work that we are hoping to do, or rather we are doing in Milli. So that's why we have held on to the name Milli. The concept of Milli as a collective of individuals and communities who came together to nurture archives or to protect the endangered archives. The idea started way back in 2018 or so. And of course, the informal group kept the discussions on. When globally we were under COVID-19, the pandemic was on and almost everything was on a standstill. Milli used the opportunity positively by holding its first ever week-long Milli session from 8th to 13th June 2020. Ever since then, the sessions have been going on each year. In that particular year especially, we saw multiple institutions, individuals, organizations from across the world come together to share their knowledge, to share their information about various archiving practices going on globally. So this was one opportunity that archives community got globally. And as we have been seeing in different sessions, different archives also gets an opportunity to showcase their collections apart from holding discussions on various topics related to archives and archiving. So that's why we are here. And of course, as ICA has already designated this day and this week for us, we are here to continue the work. This year, of course, we are doing it virtually. Otherwise, we were doing it in a hybrid mode mostly. If you browse our website, you can see the past sessions that Milli had conducted. You can see more details about that. What we also observed is that there was a great demand for some kind of support system to be worked up. So that's when, Milli decided that, we have to formalize ourselves as a group. And with that intention, Milli Archives Foundation was set up as a Section 8 nonprofit company on 22nd April 2023. And when we set up, of course, we have set up with only 3 of us. We already named them in the beginning. Only 3 of us are there at the moment as co-directors. We hope to expand by having a council of governors very shortly. What are the objectives and the activities that we are carrying on? The objectives are, in fact, all our activities are centered around the 4 objectives that we started with. First is help individuals, families, or smaller institutions to collect, build, preserve, and nurture archives and protect endangered archives. Educate and build capacities for managing these archival collections. Of course, these come through various training programs, and we hope to have them right from school level to professional level. Research and develop public tools for archives so that they can work on it. Engage the public to reimagine the archives as part of their commons. This is something which we hope that the people will come closer to archives. Right now in our country, we have seen that there is a long gap. What are the challenges that Milli has been facing? Apart from lack of experience for the co-directors, the biggest challenge has been finance. Currently, individual donations have been our main source of income. More than the amount, it's the gesture of support that has come from friends and other well-wishers. It has been very encouraging for us. Service contracts have also been of immense help to us in surviving. But being a Section 8 company, there are restrictions on the kind of donations or money we get. We cannot accept money from anybody who's not an Indian national. We cannot go for any foreign funding. We do not have FCRA clearance. And the number of service contracts that we take up in a year cannot exceed more than 20% of our total income. And to top it all, we do not have any government grant, and we are yet to get any major grant from a philanthropic organization, although we are trying for some. So Milli definitely needs support from all well-wishers and friends out there. We continue to look forward to help in the form of money or otherwise. As I said, support need not always be monetary. It can come in the form of volunteering also. Especially youngsters who are very keen about archives, who want to do something for archives, this is the right opportunity. You can volunteer for some of the projects that we have taken up. Similarly, professionals with expertise in the field. It would be really great if some of you can at least join Milli and be part of the efforts that we are doing. I conclude by conveying our sincere thanks to all the individuals and institutions who have been part of our journey this far and supported us in their own special way. Special thanks to our company secretary and the auditors also, who have been doing a lot of hand-holding for us. So in this Archives Week, let us all come together to nurture archives, protect the endangered archives, and build up a world of information sharing through open access tools and platforms that are accessible to all. Thank you. Now I'll request my colleague and co-director Venkat Srinivasan to tell you more about our ongoing projects. Venkat?
Thanks, Jaya, and hi everyone. It's lovely to see everyone sort of come together at this time of the year. So just to pick up on what Jaya said, the broader intent has been always the case, has been to look at collecting, educating, engaging, and doing research. There are 4 broad projects that we've sort of been pushing this year. Of course, as most of you who've been joining the sessions in the last 4 or 5 years know, it is and still will remain a collective in the sense that it is run through a largest network of volunteers. There have been over 50 volunteers over the last 4 years and over 40 participating institutions and over 1,500 registrants over the last few years. And so that's just been very heartwarming to see. The work that we're focusing on this year would be around 2 of the branches. One is to looking at collection. So this is to really develop what we're calling a benchmarking qualitative or a quality of an archive survey, which we just started a few months ago. And if this is something you're interested in, do just send an email to hello@milli.link. And this is simply a small but hopefully valuable way to ask, how do you assess the quality of an archive? This doesn't mean that Milli is an enforcement body by any measure. It is just offering benchmarking support for various organizations to self-evaluate along whatever measure they see fit so that they can sort of push the boundaries in the area that they're working in. Another thing that we're putting out as an open access document or module would be a teaching module, a 2-day workshop that we developed on how to construct or think about archives so that people, institutions and individuals can sort of use that as a ready reckoner as they go forward. A third project that we've been pushing through for the last 4 years has been to develop an annotation protocol. This is sort of along our research vertical. And this is to have the public at large be able to describe and add context and content to archival words. So this is to look at archival description across various archives and just simply say that the public can strengthen the way in which you look at the same material. So the discovery of the archival object can be strengthened based on how each individual responds to the same archival object. This will be an open source platform that we're doing in collaboration with a variety of individuals and organizations. And finally, the guidebook, which I think many of you might be familiar with, but if you are not, we can put a link in the chat, which will be the focus of the conversation that I'll hand off to Farah in a little bit. And the guidebook has been looking at the intersection of ethics, law, and archives in India in particular. And it's meant to be a guidebook for archivists. It was launched a couple of years ago, and Farah will tell you a little bit more about the current context of where it's at. But it's been an ongoing work, and it's something that we're hoping to revise as we go forward. And we look for feedback and comment from the broader community of archivists and users of archives to make it a better document that's perhaps more usable for various archives in the country. These are sort of the 4 research-oriented projects that we are running. As again, everything that Milli does is around being open access and committed to being visible to the country at large, and whatever it takes to nurture an archive. That's what this effort has been about. To that end, we're super happy and delighted to say that we've also reached out to developing a governing circle of various institutions that will take these ideas forward. And we've had now over a dozen committed institutions that have formally agreed to being part of a governing circle of ideas and research projects and some of the open access initiatives that do come out of the stables of Milli. These include the various IITs, IIMs, various museums, various corporate archives, various thematic archives. And so we're very, very happy to sort of see this coming together of institutions and individuals towards strengthening standards in this country. So thanks again to all of these individuals who are making this possible. I am going to now hand it over to Farah, who is going to give you a perspective on the latest iteration of this guidebook that we have worked on. Farah Amin is an archives and information management professional in London, and of course has been a strong lead and conceptualizer of ideas for the Milli Archives Foundation. Farah, over to you.
Thanks, Venkat. Because a lot of people joined us, are still joining us. Just reiterating some housekeeping, we are recording this session and we have requested permission from Shubha to record her talk as well. So if you would like to not have your video/audio recorded, I would suggest that you turn off your mic and cameras. Regardless of whether you want to be recorded or not, I would suggest that you please turn off your mics so that we don't have any background noises interrupting the conversation. So yeah, I mean, this year we're flexing a little bit again. We've done a bit of work in preparation for this Archives Week. But let us take you through what the guidebook was, because I can see that a lot of us are new to Milli and it's great to see our tribe grow. Please join us, please volunteer with us. Like Jaya said, we want more people, we want more activity. So the guidebook, if you click on the link that I just shared on the chat box, and Venkat has just shared on the chat box, it will lead you to the guidebook. The guidebook was written by Divij, who is not here unfortunately today, and me. And the idea was that archivists like us across the private sector and in the public sector, we often struggle with how laws apply to the archives. So what is the position of archives in terms of copyright laws? What are fair use exemptions for us? Are we allowed to use are we allowed to digitally reproduce? What are the exemptions within copyright law for research? But also in terms of, does an archive own what it has? So in the last 3 years now, I think, Venkat, is that right? We put together this guidebook on how the legal framework in India applies to the guidebook, and there have been some developments since we since we put the guidebook out, such as the DPDP bill being passed, it's still not notified, so it's not in action, but it will apply to archives. So we are trying to make sure that archivists have enough support in terms of, in terms of knowing how these laws apply to archive and what exemptions are available to us, so that we are able to extend our archives to their fullest possible capacities to our users and our researchers. So this year, what we have done is prepared a small brochure for the archive. Venkat, have you already put the link for that?
Yeah, I mean, if you just click the link that I've shared, that should take you to a link within that for the brochure. Yeah.
Yeah. So even though we've tried to make sure that our guidebook is as easy to follow as possible, law tends to be dense, and Venkat calls it a tomb. It's an 80-page tomb, but Venkat calls it a tomb. So the idea was to simplify things in terms of, if you have a quick question about who typically owns copyright, we have put it in the brochure now and say, okay, the person who typically owns copyright is the first author, or somebody, or if you are in employment, it's the person who is employing you, or the organization that is employing you. So simple questions like that you often come across when you are putting up the guidebook, when you are working with your archives. We also have a ready reckoner for the kind of paperwork you should have around your archives to make sure that you can claim ownership, that you know where your what your ownership or intellectual property rights are, and to respect your donors. A very important part of the guidebook, and the second part, is the ethics and how we approach ethics in archives. And while there is law, we also have to think about ethics and what we owe to our researchers, to our donors, to our subjects. When I say subjects, I mean subjects in archives, not our subjects. And we are going to be talking about some of this in Shubha's conversation. Shubha, I've tried very hard to memorize your bio, but Shubha has worked in the industry, in the sector for 40 years. I will not call it an industry. So it's very, very hard to memorize a bio, and I don't have the best memory. But Shubha has worked at the Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology for the last 40 years. And what we are trying to do here is put our guidebook in context. So what we have done in the guidebook is not something that has emerged out of nowhere. It is a conversation that's been going on globally and in India over several years. And through changes in politics and funding for archives, and archives being stronger and weaker over a period of time, the ethics and legal framework has affected archives in different ways. And there have been resources historically, and then they've been galvanized, and then they have disappeared. And Shubha is going to give you some of the context for that. She's extensive work on ethnomusicology and ethnomusicology research in Kutch and Rajasthan, and one more place that I have forgotten. But the Archives and Research Center has existed since the 1980s. So she has a very good idea of how we have literally worked through laws in the past and what that means for us today. And she's also been a consultant for the WIPO Creative Heritage Project. Is that right, Shubha? And the UNESCO Intangible Heritage Intellectual Property something. Sorry, cannot remember things. But yeah, what I'm saying is Shubha has worked for the best organizations in the world, gathering resources for archivists to do their ethics right, get their laws right. And I will hand over to her and stop talking because you clearly want me to do that. Shubha, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Well, hello everyone, and thanks Farah, but thanks Milli, thanks Venkat, Jaya, and everybody for asking me to speak today. It's a really great honor, and I'm so delighted to be here, have been fortunate to be part of Milli from the year it started. And also I think important day today when we are kind of launching this guidebook, which I think is the beginning of something that could turn out to be very important. And the fact that it's happening in India, the fact that we have Milli, which has brought together so many kinds of archives than even me, who was in the world of archives for many years, knew about. I think the timing is just so right and have to congratulate Venkat, Jaya, Maya, whoever's at the beginning to have pulled this together. I think we all met at the Socio-Innovation Studies workshop for archives when this was just a thought. So in short, I'm very honored and delighted to be here. And I'm going to try my best to do, in this time, deal with this very complicated, what I think. I'm just worried about leaving out too many things, but I'll try and do my best. So I'll just share the screen. There we go. Do you want to let me share the screen, somebody?
Jaya, could you make Shubha a co-host? Thanks.
Yeah, it's not letting me share yet.
You can try now. Should work.
Okay,
I think now you can.
I can now. Yes.
Yeah.
I just couldn't to start with. Okay. I need to, oh, good Lord, go back to say, I think I need to get out and make sure I'm doing the slide right. This is for some reason from beginning. Okay. This is complicated. All the bars of Zoom are going all over the place. So, okay, sorry. So I'm just going to run all over the place. So yes, welcome to this very complicated area of ethics that goes all over the place, as we can see. We're dealing with some with law, with ethics. Now, when Farah first talked to me about doing this talk today, I don't know why this is slipping all the time. Okay. She wanted me to review my 40 years in archives, talk about the challenges we've been facing. And so it's meant to be a little autobiographical, which I haven't tried, but I've tried to keep this kind of a train of what we've been through in India in the earlier years, how we've thought about various aspects with ethics and so on. And of course, we all have to place ourselves somewhere. So I will say that I'm part of, as she's already told you, an Archives and Research Center for Ethnomusicology, but I feel part of the larger world of archives all the same. So though some of my examples I'll talk to you would be about my work, I'm hoping that it'll be more general. So as we've already been saying, law, ethics, and intellectual property rights are all kind of connected in some way. And so one of the things that we talked about was looking at change, looking at how technology has brought in change, how, our ethics, the way we are looking at things have changed, how the laws have changed. So we're looking at, I'm trying to look at this whole thing as a series of changes and how we respond to them. Also that these areas which seem fixed are not actually things that were part of what we thought were ethics have become part of law. Things that were IPR part, not really part of the law, have moved in, and so on. There have been moral rights that have become part of law, and so on. To me, ethics always meant for what law did not do for us. For me, ethics always stands for that area that we think ought to be there. Either there is no law for it, or there's a gap, or the law says something that we would rather not follow, and so on. So ethics to me is this, hopefully that is shrinking, and more of it will come into the law. But I think as we keep facing newer changes and as how we think about things change also, we will be broadening what we bring under ethics. So as a result, what this gets reflected in the archives of today are, like we have very proudly the Milli guidelines today, but all of this has found its way through many years, through manuals, through agreement forms and contracts, through the policies that archives make. This is typically how archives have tried to own this area of law, ethics, and IPR and rights, actually, in various ways. looking at it in a different way. Law to me, or when most of us are talking about, is largely to do with copyright. And that is what it has meant to most of us when we are looking at what law is for archives. The Copyright Act is more to do with the individual. And one of the big problems that we've faced more and more in current times rather than earlier times was the lack of the law to deal with community rights, community ownership, something that we all have to deal with. And traditional cultural expression, community rights, their terminologies have been changing, fortunately. And the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, has been dealing with this area a little more than anywhere else. So that's just to give you a little background. You've been already introduced to this, but to say that about myself, where I'm coming from is that I work for an ethnomusicology archives, which means my basis is in audiovisual archives, though it's changing these days to bring in a lot of other media and paper and so on, that I'm involved with research and documentation and fieldwork. So when I talk about ethics and the challenges we've faced, or I talk about, this is where I come from. That's just to give you a small intro there. What is very heartening when the Milli guidebook came out is that, and looking at all our literature, because of having to talk about it today, I noticed how the number of guidelines by professional societies, museums, archives, and so on, have really been on the increase in the last 2 decades. Most of them have come up after 2000. That means there's been more and more a consciousness of these ethical issues. There's been more need for archives to deal with ethics, not only archives, but as I said, professional societies, museums, and so on. Museums, I think, earlier because of collecting objects. When I started out, the only early example, and that's something I would really ask you to look at, is the guidelines that were produced by ARCE, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It was something that we all used to look at and say, oh, how wonderful this must be to be in archives that had something like this. Way back in the early 80s, ARCE had very good ethical guidelines, and they had the catalog called Mura, which means pathway or something in one of the Aboriginal languages, where they did also manage to control access in very interesting ways to a member of the tribe, so that if a moiety or a clan wanted to own some things and did not want others to see it, they could still access the catalog and only they would be able to see it. Or if there were songs that men should not hear that women sing, this would allow access of that nature, which seemed very amazing at the time. So this is something that also that we would like to keep coming back to, is the issue of customary access, of ethics, taking in what the tradition also wants to own. So, so where does ethics come in for archives? Pretty much comes everywhere. It comes in acquisition for sure, when we acquire, how we acquire legally and ethically, and all the steps that we need to put in place with it. In selection and prioritization, for sure, how we represent communities or performers or whoever create material through cataloging and metadata. Though largely, most of us have talked about ethics in terms of access and dissemination. Here is where we seem to face the largest challenge. But according to me, very important part of ethics of archives is also preservation, because if we don't preserve what we have, so our basic ethics as archivists should be to the goal of preservation, according to me. So I hope that I will be able to kind of look at all these aspects in ways that we go on. It sounds like a very long time, but suddenly I'll find it's gone. So just to do a kind of brief trace of where we were many years ago, when I started in the early 80s. At that time, a lot of the archives were really pre-existing collections, legacy collections that somebody decided now it should become an archive, looking at collections, and they come with pre-existing conditions. So there isn't too much that you could do. They were all collections institutionalized in some way or the other. Early 80s, there was a great movement to archives. We started in 82, and when we looked around at colleagues, apart from a few earlier ones, the government archives, of course, but in the cultural field, there were very few. At that time, I think the perception was very much of archives as owners. This is what we own. There was a great sense of proprietary, and I think a lot of negative feeling about archives was from that kind of feeling. Everybody thought archivists are just people who sit in dark, dingy basements and hang on to everything and don't let anyone look at it. At the time, if there was anything about the law we thought of, there was a lot of preoccupation with copyright and a lack of understanding of where we were with it. So most archives then tended to not have very successful access or dissemination. So I think that's the earlier thing. A little later, we see, and as I said, late 80s and so on, there was more proactive collection and creation of archives. Collections like ours coming up, where we work with voluntary deposit, with soliciting collections, trying to set up archives. There was a greater movement. A lot of archives came out of documentation and field work in folklore archives, for instance, or music archives, research archives. So there was an increase in these. And then as a result, we started looking at collectors, depositors, researchers as all being stakeholders as part of this process. So what we see as the spread of ethics was starting to include other constituencies. And much more recently, we've come to looking at community archives or archives that work in partnership with communities. And so we're talking about community ownership. So we've kind of gone the whole trace from archive ownership to today looking at community ownership and seeing that as a very important ethical prerequisite in everything that we do. So going back to try and give you a sense of the earlier years, as Farah said, I'd worked with WIPO, but one of the things I did was we did a survey around 2000, I think, for WIPO, a survey of archives and libraries and similar organizations in India to see how people dealt with rights, what the issues were. And we sent around questionnaires, we collected forms and documents, and we also had a small workshop and brought people together. So this is what came out of that at that time. These were, remember, very early days of digitization. So we weren't looking at the kind of ease or the problems that digitization would then bring. But we're already in 2000 looking at an area where technology change has become a major issue. What is interesting is if you look at these issues today, and I would like to reflect at the end of it to say how much has changed, I don't know. So people who were working in fieldwork, documentation, and research, and trying to get permissions and contracts, face these kind of issues, that there was either lack of literacy, you could not ask people to sign, or in too many situations, it was culturally inappropriate for people to sign contracts, or to figure out who should be the representative, who should be the stakeholder, who's the leader, who can represent a community or a group of performance, and the problem of getting permissions for festivals and public events. How on earth do you take permission there? How do you make sure that you've got permission to record and in fact to later on go on and use? So archives, at that time, these were the main problems that came up. A lot of archives, because they started with existing materials, had a lot of legacy material without documentation. Not just small places, even people like the Sangeet Natak Academy, or even when we started with forms from the very beginning, but a lot of people had material that they do not know exactly where it came from. They don't know who owned it, they don't know who created, or even if they knew who the performer was, they had no idea how. So we'd faced this with many institutions who were saying, how can I give copies? How can we give access? But it's very valuable, so we should keep it. We should archive it, but we really don't know whether we have the right to use this in any way. There was definitely lack of clear guidelines available to us. The legal situation was very unclear before 95. The Copyright Act just talked about all the areas that we talked in cultural archives came under expressions of folklore. So it was not protected in any way. Then the institutional policies and the copyright law always at odds. Then what happens is that we get the performer right as part of the copyright, and fair use came in 1995. So there's a good example of what happens when something that we in ARCE had extended our agreement forms to include performers as early as 1985, but then that became part of the law and strengthened our hands. So that became part of the Copyright Act, and also fair dealing, fair use came in. Otherwise, we had very unclear ideas of what could we deal with? How do we deal with these? So suddenly you had a performer right, but you had legacy materials for which you had taken no performer clearance. So there were these kind of issues. How could you exactly deal with fair dealing? And of course, a major problem was the inability to control further use. You may ethically get an agreement signed that this is what this person is going to use it for research only or for this or that purpose, but how do you prevent them from then further passing it on in other ways? And we see right from those days that user expectations start to change. The more the archive world was growing, the more different larger constituencies were starting to see the value of archival material. The kind of expectations were changing, which of course is the greatest change comes when the internet comes in. So creators and communities, what most of those people felt that there was a need to look at individual and community rights separately. That an individual's composition, just because they became a part of a community, didn't automatically become community. There are more contemporary forms where we should look at individual. There are other things which are traditional, how do you identify the community that owns it? How do you find, representation? So this was it. If there was a major issue with performers, with communities, was acknowledge and attribution. This is a very major issue that I think definitely is part of any of our ethical guidelines, the importance of acknowledgement and attribution. And once when I looked at a lot of legal thing of all the kind of court cases we've had in this cultural field of copyright violation, a lot of them were to do with acknowledge and attribution. That a lot of those things would not have gone to court or would have not become contentious if proper acknowledgement and attribution had been done. Another aspect that came up is protection of artistic integrity, that if you give a recording, here I'm talking more of recordings and other things, and people want to learn from it or use it, how do they protect what is integrity? How that doesn't get, changed in some way and then still passed on as that. So this is a big issue. Something that I will not be dealing with because it really goes outside ethics and becomes very big is the issue of revenue and profits. So wherever there's any perceived profit, and archives will have to have some money to run themselves, as we know, the issue of revenue comes up. What is seen as profit or what is assumed to be profitable may not always be the case, but the perception of revenue is a very, very big issue that will affect archives. And another is access to archival materials. There's a lot of people who are the creators of material, who might have been the owners or community members or composers or performers who had problems with the fact that they do not then have very often access to archival materials of which they are the traditional owners in many cases. So that is part of our ethical framework that we should long-term, and we have tried to bring that into ARCE, into our more current forms to make sure that community members are ensured ongoing access to their material. So what were the final recommendations that archives were charged with from this group that we put it all together and through the workshop was that archives should take a role in legal support to performers. That a lot of people did see that archives were in that kind of space where they were not really benefiting in some way and could take a role in doing that, and that we should involve performers. Now, for performer, we can change it to any person who's involved in formulating contracts, that we formulate contracts and agreements with all us archive people, not always taking in the viewpoint of the creator or owner of these kind of materials. There's also the importance of covering future uses and technologies. Now, this really came to the fore when we came with digitization and the internet, which we could have not dreamt about in the 80s, that there would be a time when you would be able to make copies as good as the original, and the fact that it could be put somewhere, the internet, where it would be as good as publishing and could reach about anybody. Now, there's no way that we would have thought of that, and that permission forms at that time would have not covered anything like this. So there's a need to look at future use, future technologies and try and cover that. Now, agreements should also include a clause for renegotiation for commercial uses and licenses. So that's come up because through time, the way archival materials being used has changed. We never thought of many things as having a commercial use, that something, documents could be part of publications that would be commercial or commercial recordings, or that you could charge money by putting things on the internet, or you could license things. So the way that archival materials are used has really expanded exponentially, and we may not have covered those. So if you are going beyond what you took permission for initially, there is a need to work in renegotiation. Then there is a need for proactive outreach by archives, that we cannot just sit there and say passive access. You can find it if you come to us, but otherwise we need to also go out and make people aware of what we have. And that it's our responsibility to keep up with changes in the laws. And that, interestingly, something that was very across the board, a lot of people wanted to say that acknowledgement and attribution should be made legally binding, that this should be made as part of the law. Now, we cannot probably do that, but as archives, I think we can try and make sure that our ethical guidelines include that. So, okay, that's gone funny there. When we to say that I'll talk about some of our projects from time to time, that ARCE, where I work, we had a project called Archives and Community Partnership, where we worked with musician communities in Goa and Rajasthan, working with communities to asking them how they would like to archive their own musical traditions, and for them to have copies and for them to be able to guide how archiving should go on. Now, part of that, we did many things, was to try and come out with a bunch of model rights, so that we worked on eliciting rights perceptions with them. We talked to people in groups and saying, who do you think owns this? How would you like permissions to be taken? Who do you think should get money? So we tried to take this. Do you think this is okay to put a copy of this on the internet? What would you like? So that was very interesting, that I thought we are always doing very bottom-up documentation, but I found that when it comes to rights, we are very top-down. We tend to tell them, no, you should have been, your permission should have been taken. You should have been given money, or nobody should have done this without your agreement. Sometimes they don't see it that way. Sometimes the individual doesn't see it. People who think, oh, their patrons actually own that music. So what is the community's own perception of ownership was very important. And we tried to look at NGOs and commercial agencies to see how people are dealing with, and very importantly, to look at non-financial parameters for inclusion, like attribution, like getting copies, and so on. So we only think of money, and that doesn't always work. So we need to think of that and try to bring in access, respect, recognition. This is phrases I would like to come back to again and again. And we tried to do this. And at least for this project, we managed to administer the material accordingly. So, coming to the archivist. So where does the role of the archivist come with ethics? All over, as we say. Every act that we do actually has ethical considerations. But I would like to go back and put preservation on top, that it's part of our ethical responsibility to make sure that the material survives, that it has the right storage, that we give access in ways that doesn't destroy it, that we do the best possible to preserve the material as well as we can. That's our first ethical responsibility, according to me. There are very many areas. The archivists work as curators for selection. Don't forget, you end up representing. The way you represent something in your catalog, in your metadata, in how you give access is how that will get known forever. So looking at it as, archives for posterity, I think the role of the archivist as curator and how you represent is very, very important. As I said, as is the selection, of which there's a lot of politics of selection takes place in various ways, ensuring access. Keeping abreast with legal changes is really the responsibility of an archivist, and to update guidelines and manuals for ethical considerations. I think that we need to document all our processes and procedures, and the ethical guidelines should be a very important part of that. I have lost somewhere something. I'm just trying to see. Okay. The heading has gone off here. This is the advantages that we have when we had the major change of digitization and the internet. So I think digitization had major impacts on how we handled material, so how it affected ethics. But more than anything, it's the internet that has had the greatest impact in ways that we could have never thought of. And it has taken us some time in India for us to be able to really use the internet the way they were using in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. In the West, it took us much longer. By the time we have access all over the place. So the advantages of the internet have been helping us to preserve and restore, safeguard, definitely, and promote. We can promote in ways we've never done, provide many more educational and scholarly opportunities, enhance cultural exchange, reach new and niche audiences. I think that has been very, very important in projects that I've worked on, because suddenly you have diaspora that become the biggest supporters of certain Goan forms that I worked with, or in Rajasthan, so on. So you're able to reach the kind of audiences where there were very few people and nobody was interested, but suddenly worldwide you have a thing that's only possible through that. And dissemination, of course, has become very easy and goes beyond physical and geopolitical boundaries, which is something that was a major thing. So they have been the big advantages of the internet for us. But what have been our biggest challenges for digitization and the internet? So digitization, if one wanted to go through it slowly, we first were dealing with objects that were digitized as objects, and then they go on to files, and the original becomes as good as, there's nothing called the original. Your every copy is as good as the original. So all of this has changed how we will use and how we ethically handle our material. The problems have been, and these are the biggest challenges we're facing today, is unauthorized use of culturally sensitive materials. We're not able to prevent it if it's on the internet. There is something I'm calling non-profit sharing, is that people put up what they would like on the internet, whether you have the right to do it or not, and you give permission for people to download whether you have it or not, and you're not making money. So it cannot be called commercial. Now, this is a very dicey situation, because we, of course, all know that what's happening with YouTube, you're not getting money for actually uploading it, but you're getting part of ad revenue. So it's a very sticky area, and that's something that's affecting things a lot. It's affected the music industry entirely. And that you have no control over everybody who's recording in a concert and is going to put up a phone recording on YouTube the very next day. So the control, sharing, all those ethics go for a toss. And here we do feel the importance of representation. We do feel that creators have a right as to be able to choose what they would like to be on the internet, how they would like to be known, what gets distributed. So when we've done our CDs at the time or put up, we made sure that the entire selection was with the performer. So there's ways that you should be looking at that, and that's become very, very hard to do. Obviously, publication without permission or authorization has become very, very easy. As a result, already said, commercial exploitation and violation of moral and ethical rights has become some of our biggest challenges. So archives, just looking at them, we can think that archives are very uniquely situated. We are the ones who are in between the collector, the public, the community, the user. We are in a very unique position. And I think one of the advantages that we are in a position to actually assign rights is what we do. When we administer collections, we are assigning rights, we are assigning ownership. So our position there is really very important. And I think that archives can and should, and today with Milli, we are doing our best to make sure that this is done ethically, that we are looking at our ethical obligations to all the constituencies with whom we are in touch. So I think that advocacy for ethics and rights and responsibility and respect are areas that archives should really be looking at supporting, because we are in a position, and we can already see that one of the earliest things that Milli opted to do was to bring out these guidelines. And so I think I would suggest that archives should take an active role in the creation of ethical guidelines, as we've done, but also awareness of ethical use for users. So we try and do that at ARCE. We've created some documents for users to be aware. I think a lot of the time people are not aware, and if you make them aware of the implications of how they want to use things, then people do understand, as do collectors. When you say, okay, they're signing an agreement, but when you're saying, oh, nobody can have a copy, without realizing you're even preventing the community or the performer from having a copy. So once we kind of create more awareness and while doing field work, also to collectors, and also give greater awareness of rights and ethics as a result to community members, creators, and performers, to make people aware of their own rights. I have been once or twice asked to do that, to say, would you address a group of people and tell them what is their right? And very often they don't know. And very often it's the other extreme. People think they have extreme ownership and rights when they don't. So it's kind of very interesting to see, what perceptions of rights are across the board. There can be 0 to 10 at any given time. So I think that archives are in a very unique position to actually deal with this and create greater awareness of ethics in all the communities that we interact with. So I'll end with that. Thank you. And I've kept it brief so that I hope we have enough time for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Shubha. That was fantastic. And also brief, which I am very surprised by, because usually we inevitably run over.
I was very scared of running over, and that's why I was late logging on. I was busy lopping off slides. That's losing track of what I cut off. But anyway.
Yeah, no, that is great, because a lot of the questions that you raise is exactly what we tried to address in the ethics section of the archive. So the ethics section was a collaborative effort by if I remember the number correctly, about 16 archivists. And Shubha was one of the leading lights. She's also the reviewer of the guidebook. So
Yeah, but
Shubha,
I tried to come at it from a different angle than the guidebook I was hoping anyway.
yeah, no, I'm just saying that some of the questions that you have raised, such as thinking about ethics along with law, for instance, and to not just be legally correct, but also to be ethically correct, especially when working with vulnerable communities, is an important aspect of what we're trying to do with the guidebook. But yeah, I have a question, Shubha. So you started working in the 1980s, and there have been changes, say, to the copyright law ever since. And you talked about how you did not, for instance, have rights with performance. And even today, Indian copyright law is not clear on the rights of community or collectively held intellectual property. So, what did you do when the laws changed? And did you go back to get permissions from the performers, or did you do that somehow differently? Because for us, the data protection law is going to change a lot of things, and we will not have the paperwork for that, and it will apply to a lot of the archives, even though there are exemptions for us.
Thank you, Farah. There's where, some of our ethical thinking went ahead of the rights. We realized pretty early that, but our own form always said that we take no responsibility of how this came in, because you could not tell people when you're a voluntary deposit-based archive, you could not say now, 40 years from now, you should have taken permission. But we were encouraging people from the beginning to get performer permission. So we did have some in place. We also helped, this is all my advocacy part of it, we also helped some of the people who were making recordings to draft documents for them that they could give people they were recording to say, your recordings are in this archive. Not only that you had permission, but you can go back and get a copy anytime. So we've done a few of those things. But where we did go back and do paperwork was when we got into what was then called the Global Sound Project of the Smithsonian, which is now Folkways, become part of Folkways, where we were putting up material for paid downloads. And for that, we went back. We've got over 200 tracks now and some more in the works. We've gone back there to every performer and got their permissions. And the recordists and the researchers. So that was a lot of paperwork. But we started doing that before the law changed, actually. So that was interesting. But yes, there is nothing to deal with community rights. There is no joint ownership. But then we look at other countries and things that, we thought Australia had this wonderful thing because each tribe, but when we talk to archivists in Australia, they say it's not really working. And the best you can do is to, is label to say this belongs to this community. So which is also the same kind of feedback I got when we talked about Nimbuda, we talked about the song in Bobby with performers to say, they used your song like this. And at the end of it, they all said they should have at least said it's ours. That
I don't think a lot of people here have context for both of those references.
Okay. So yeah. So when there are songs that traditional songs that went into Hindi films and then got copyrighted as part of a film song, which meant that the community from where it came then had no right to perform it if you went by the law, which of course nobody follows, so it's fine. But when you talk to the performing communities about it, in the end, a lot of the feeling was at least it should have been said it's ours. People do realize that it's very impossible if you use something or a design of wall painting or whatever, you use something and it goes public, then how do you go back to a community which is thousands of people over many thousands of villages, to try and reimburse them? You cannot. So unless there's some organization or something. So the problems in dealing with the revenue of things ethically gets very difficult. But what we found is that most people felt that if they had been just acknowledged that this is the ownership, that people want to say this belongs to this community or this tribe or this whatever, then people would have found it more acceptable.
Okay, I see I've been hogging all the questions. If anybody else has questions, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat box and we'll take it from there. But it would be nice if you raised your hand and came up. Maya, you had gone off mute. Do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, Shubha, thank you. That was a lifetime of insight, and you remind us of actually the primary purpose of and ethics of preservation, which I think we sometimes lose sight of in, other conversations. So, what's happening nowadays is that in the name of the digital, people think preservation is no longer a problem, that the digital will itself preserve. And yet, I think a great statement you made was this idea that there is no more original in the digital. So, how does one reconcile custodianship with the lack of an original in kind of remix culture and such?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because in my enthusiasm of lopping up slides, I took off mine on digitization, which I felt that the ethics of digitization is really, and that is something again falls by the wayside these days, because I thought I was going off in too many directions. I think the ethics of digitization demands that we make the best possible digital copy there is, and we get the highest resolution or the best sample rate or whatever, because that is what is going to represent that object in the future for posterity. And so doing any level of digitization and thinking it's very fine, making MP3s and whatever is really not ethical in my viewpoint. And so the way to deal with this is really metadata, because in administrative, we have preservation metadata where we get in the information of, what generation it is, what the original, where it came from, on what it was digitized. So preservation and administrative metadata is meant to really look after that. But there's nothing to prevent you from not using it.
Absolutely. And we're looking to do a part 2 of this guidebook with regards to the new laws that are coming in, as well as, of course, specific questions for the digital. So I'm hoping the Milli community can again pitch in and, we can hear many voices. I don't see any questions in the chat, but should anyone want to raise their hand or chime in, please, this is a good time. Yeah.
Looks like I could have kept it longer. I was worried.
Yes. Any additional comments, Shubha, that you might have wanted to make but didn't in the interest of time?
Yeah, well, the digitization was one major aspect that you made me think of. Also, the importance of, what has happened with earlier forms of digital also. The fact that you had portability, that a lot of, so I think also fragility of the original, which was a big problem and that you could not deal with. But the importance, I feel, that ethically to keep the original as much as you can is because you never know. Because if you see that it's part of our ethical responsibility to see that this lasts, that it is preserved, then that is really, if that becomes your primary ethical obligation, then you're also looking at trying to preserve as many originals as you can, because technology will change, as we've seen so often, and then you'll have a newer technology that will do it better, or the technology fails. I mean, who has floppies now on which they saved things are not there anymore. So it's not like the digital is safe in any way, as we know, but we're forced to go with it. Also,
Right.
I wanted to talk about digital obsolescence, which is exactly this. But then I found it was, we can go back, because any of these areas, or talking about metadata representation, archivists as curators, and what we do, I'd really kind of squished it all. But, there are very, very major responsibilities. Ethics is how we label, how we call, how we write names, whether we're particular about how people get represented, when we make selections, when we decide to deaccession, what are all the issues that go in there towards the creators.
Right.
I think
We have a hand up from Sharika. Sharika, I'm going to unmute you, hoping that you can then ask your question. Sharika, can you?
Hello. Hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I think it gave a lovely history also of anyone interested in how archives have progressed in India over the past 30, 40, 50 years. My question is regarding how an archivist, in your experience, balances their duties towards preservation and access, because there are not just time constraints, but funding. How do you prioritize, especially now that access requests are expanding? Like you said, the constituency of access, people requesting access is just greatly multiplying. So how does an archivist approach that, or any instances where that has really come out as a major challenge, or resolutions for the same?
Oh, well, I used to say it used to be the biggest tightrope. That was my favorite question years ago, that the tightrope balancing of an archivist is between preservation and access. And I think that was very true in the pre-digital, when you could say letting somebody handle something when you didn't have a working copy for it was actually going to damage your original, as it happens still in some of our archives. But what do you do if you see your primary responsibility to the public or to whoever who you have as your audience? How do you deal with that? I think once it's the digital material, as long as you have the right permissions and so on, I don't find that such a big difficulty. But to say you have material of things that you haven't digitized and you have somebody who wants access to it, then you say, oh, do I just let them use the original? Or will I say, no, please make an appointment and come back because I'd like to digitize it first? So I do still feel that I feel it's ethical to give priority to the preservation part of it. And that is one of the big advantage of the digitized world, is that, we have lower resolution, easier files that we can email people, material as long as you have the permissions. So dealing with access, there's just a lot more access to deal with, but still it is much easier now to deal with than before. But thank you for the question.
Shubha, in the chat, there's a very long question, and I'm happy to read it out. I'm
Yes.
sure you can see it.
Chandan had his hand up first, so can we take that one and then?
Yeah, let's do Chandan first. Sorry, Chandan, if we can ask you to unmute. Chandan, can you unmute?
Okay, I think that's done it. Good afternoon, and thank you all for this wonderful session, and especially Ms. Chaudhuri. It has been a fascinating lecture, and I've been able to learn so much. But one thing that has been in my head for a long time, I've worked for a few years in a text archives, and therefore, one thing I find is that we are losing a lot of text. Since you've been working with communities in ethnomusical subjects, I was wondering whether there is awareness about the need to preserve. I feel a bit hurried because we're at the end of the session, but what is happening is that both textual material and also musical material, which has a long heritage, I think both are disappearing. To give you an example, letter writing has virtually stopped.
Yes.
And that is a huge loss. What is a greater loss is that letters are not being preserved. That people, as they empty houses, throw away old letters. In our country, especially where the sense of the historical is sadly missing in general, that is happening in a major way. I suspect that what is happening in traditional communities also is the younger generations are also getting out of touch with their performative arts, especially in music and oral traditions. Maybe not as rapidly as what's happening in the urban areas, but it still is happening. So I think one of the important responsibilities, perhaps of all, everyone who's been involved, or who's here, is to how do you spread awareness amongst those who are kind of far from the mainstream, far from the archives? How do you bring them in and make them aware of what they have and how precious it is and the need to preserve it? That is one question. Other question is related to digital obsolescence. It is much more real than people believe it is.
Yes.
Because of change in technology, change in formats, so many things are happening. Why not think in terms of analog? Preservation in the analog. Like we have world across the world, you have archives giving up microfilms. I think that is a terrible move. And I think what happened in the British Library last year, their entire, what do you call it? I'm forgetting. But anyway, they lost a lot of material that was on microfilms. That was not on microfilms, that was totally digitized. So do you think it might be a better idea to go in for analog? Sorry, there are two questions. I think first one certainly takes priority.
Yeah, I'll take the last one first. As I already said, I totally believe in, as to the extent that you can, is to preserve the original papers, not called analog, but whatever you have by way of documents, whatever, everything. I think you should try and keep the original as much as you can. Digitization has its benefits. We know we can stall one degree of degeneration. You've got paper that's falling apart, but once you digitize it, your digital surrogate is stalled over there. It's not going to crumble anymore. But still we want to keep original manuscripts. So at ARCE, we do try to keep our all our original materials as safely as we can, and we cannot digitize everything always. We don't always have the means to do it. So then that's where the ethics of prioritization comes in, that you look at stuff that's more fragile and more falling apart. Also talking about letters and things like that, where they have come in with collections, we are absolutely preserving them, and we look at it as a very important research resource. Ephemera, letters, there are all these kinds of things that fall by the wayside. And I think it's very important. And I think what is nice with the kind of collective that's come up under Milli, that there's so many kinds of archives, that there small family archives, larger ones, or communities, that things are happening, which I feel will probably help that we reach more of these materials. But as I said, advocacy is something that archives should do, is to make people aware of their rights. Now, we did, as I already mentioned, a small project. I worked a little in Rajasthan, in Goa, in Kutch, to work with communities, to make them aware of their material, to bring it in, to encourage people to preserve. It's a very niche area and not a very successful one, but I think we have to keep trying, because by the time somebody realizes it, it's going to be so much later and it's gone. And everybody talks about the problem of the younger generation, but yet when there is some activity, and sometimes the technical activity and encourages youngsters more, and then they do think of what they are looking at. But all of this is very painstaking work, and so as a result, it doesn't have many takers, unfortunately. But we should not say that. Look how Milli has grown. So I think there'll be more and more. Hopefully, each of us reaching out to wherever we can would help. Thank you.
Thank you, Shubha. And I think to Vandana's point in the chat, that was a long question, but it's exactly what you said in terms of, I think the ethical obligation of archivists is advocacy in every way. And that includes what Chandan's point was, which was reaching out to communities who may not necessarily be proximate to archives, but actually sort of creating a volunteer network based on the importance of the material and sort of doing that legwork, in building those bridges. So hoping, of course, that the survey of archives that Milli will undertake and is being spearheaded by Jaya includes perhaps that other wing of also looking at what did you call them? Contributor archivists, right? In the sense of people who are close to those materials but don't think of themselves as archivists. But by doing that survey, I think at least identifying vulnerable weak spots, etc., should be part of our plan. So yeah, that being said, sorry, Jaya, you wanted to say something.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. I think to come back to my thing of community archives, we haven't dealt with it a lot. We had little representation here with Keystone, but I think community archives is the way that I was, again, part of the thing I dropped to say how I personally came to finding community archives a more meaningful part of my work, coming from a very more of a top-down scholarly archive, is because that's really where it belongs. And I think that more energy that we put into community archives or community-led archives, community partner archives, is really will be very important. And I think that that's something that we all can look at. And we have personally tried to work with 2 or 3 communities to try and set up their archives. Not with great success, it has its own problems, but at least I think that's the direction we need to go.
Jaya, do you want to go next, and then we can get Sushmita to unmute?
Yeah. Actually, this is about the communities and where things are lying around. Considering the size of our country, I mean, even if it's paper or folk music or whatever it is, we have people in archives. They have no idea where things are available. So I feel like volunteering, like anybody who knows about it, at least if people can come to us or reach out to Milli, at least if we can do something like that, it would be really great. At least to let us know that these things are available in such and such place. We can plan what can be done later, but at least we will have some idea of what is lying where. Otherwise, they'll be lost forever. We have no idea of what all material, whether it's audiovisual or written material, we have no idea where things are lying around.
Sushmita, would you be able to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I was just unsure about the network. So thank you so much. My question is actually, so I am a communication design student and I constantly deal with photographic projects as well as film projects, which means that I have seen a lot of work where there is the appropriation of archives that people talk about, like how archives are being reused in terms of blending it with the newer bodies of work, which may include footages of present time and past as well, or be it the blend of photographs from the past and making a whole new narrative. So for me, the question is, a lot of the times the narrative do not ground themselves exactly to the point where they are taken from. Like the narratives do not exactly talk about the archives as such as the primary product. So in those cases, how do we appropriate the whole thing in a way that it is not deviated from the actual context of it?
I think that's where we're talking about ethics. That's really unethical to not acknowledge the source from where you had it. And I think that you should try and follow up the source as we can, and maybe we should boycott people who don't acknowledge the sources. I think that's what I mean by advocacy of ethics, that I think that archives are the only people who will and have the space to be able to do it, because we're not in a commercially, we're not, gaining in any way from this. So we are the only people who have that ability, I think, to lead that ethical fight, to say, do not do this. You're going to do it, you at least have to acknowledge and try your best, and not try and use things that do not acknowledge the source.
Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's not easy to be ethical. It's true.
Yeah, it's like half of the time I have seen a lot of bodies of work which make me really confused about where it belongs and where it is coming from, because stories keep on building up one after another, and I don't know if the actual owners of the archives are aware of where they are being used. So it's kind of a situation, yeah. Yeah, but thank you so much. Yeah.
Unless there are some more questions, I think Farah has to leave. And on behalf of Milli, this is just, a check-in maybe in terms of the work we're doing. Of course, we need everyone on board. And thank you so much, Shubha, for doing what you do for more than 4 decades. It's not a small amount of time, and I hope we can persist in every which way. Venkat, if you'd like to sort of make any reminder announcements, I think we're at the end of our time. So
just a shout out to Shubha, as you've already done. So it's just been lovely to have Shubha's advice over these years, and thanks again from me in particular, and from everyone in the team. I just added a link in the chat just for people to get a broader context on what Milli's been trying to do, and to reiterate, of course, that it is a collective in the sense that it does rely on a network of individuals and communities. That's, without that, there is no work that can continue and be taken forward. So thanks again for being here. And hopefully some of these conversations from today can feed into a new revision of this Ethics and Law Guidebook, which we will now be starting out and sort of responding to some of the conversations we've been having in the last 2 years in this space. That's about it. Farah?
In this, want to participate, volunteer, take the conversation forward, please drop your email, drop us a link. We put our email up. It's hello@milli.link. So yeah, we've all been silent participants today, but we'd like to be more active. We'd like to see more of each other, engage in further conversations. So please do that. Please reach out to us. Please, let's do more things. Let's put out more resources so that we have a better supported archival community in India. Okay, that's it. Get back to
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. And
amazing of you to turn up and to put on all that work.
All right.
Because
we'll hang around a little bit. I guess we can stop the recording, but yeah, Jai and I, we can just hang out.